Inside two hollow bamboo canes, something illegal is still breathing. It is around the year 522. Two monks stand at a Byzantine checkpoint, robes gray with road dust, sandals worn to the shape of their feet after months of travel. A guard runs his palm along one of the canes. He feels only warm wood, ordinary as any pilgrim's staff. He does not press harder. He does not know what is packed inside, wrapped in damp mulberry leaves and moss, waiting for warmth to wake it. He does not know that Emperor Justinian is waiting in Constantinople for exactly this cargo. He does not know that a war with Persia has choked off the empire's silk supply for years, that the purple robes of senators and the silk banners of the church depend on threads the empire cannot make and cannot buy. He does not know that in the land these eggs came from, the punishment for smuggling silkworms across a border is death. The monks do not speak. They do not hurry. A man who hurries gets searched twice. Somewhere behind them, a camel shifts its weight and snorts in the heat. Somewhere ahead, past the checkpoint, past the gates, past the long climb up toward the palace, an empire is waiting to find out whether two hollow sticks of bamboo can end a monopoly that has lasted for centuries, by some accounts over 2,000 years. Rewind 3,000 years before this checkpoint, back to a legend the Chinese have told for generations. A cup of tea, so the story goes, and a cocoon that fell from a mulberry tree into it. The Empress Lei Zhu, wife of the Yellow Emperor, watches the cocoon unravel in the hot water into a single, impossibly fine thread. Historians are clear that this is legend, not record, undated and unverifiable. But it is the story China has kept for the origin of silk for roughly 4,500 years. What is not legend is the archaeology. Fragments of silk textile have been found at Neolithic sites in China, dating back over 5,000 years, proof that the technique was real long before anyone wrote it down. What is also not legend is the secrecy. For centuries, the process of raising silkworms, harvesting cocoons, and reeling silk thread was a state secret. Chinese records, and later Western accounts, agree on the severity of the punishment for anyone who tried to carry silkworm eggs, cocoons, or even the knowledge of the process beyond the borders of the empire. The historian Procopius, writing in the 6th century, notes plainly that in the land the silkworms came from, exporting the eggs was punishable by death. For roughly 2,000 years, China did not sell silk. China sold cloth, already finished, already unrecoverable as a living secret. Nobody outside its borders knew how it was made, only that it existed, and that everyone wanted it. By the time silk reached Rome, it had already crossed thousands of miles of desert and mountain, passing through the hands of Central Asian traders who took their cut at every stop. Roman writers did not know silk came from an insect. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, describes it as coming from trees, the fibers combed from leaves like wool from a plant. He was wrong about the source, but he was not wrong about the cost. Pliny estimated that Rome lost roughly 100 million sesterces a year to trade with India, Arabia, and the lands of the Seres, the silk people, for luxuries the empire could not produce itself. That is a staggering drain for an ancient economy, and Pliny complained about it in writing, calling it money spent so that Roman women could show their bodies through fabric instead of covering them. The complaint was not only about money, it was about what silk did to Roman virtue, or what Roman senators feared it did. Under the Emperor Tiberius, who ruled from the year 14 to 37, the Roman Senate debated and attempted to restrict men from wearing silk garments at all, arguing that it was an effeminate, foreign extravagance unbefitting a soldier of the empire. The historian Tacitus records the debate in his Annals. It did not work. Silk kept arriving, silk kept selling. By the height of the trade, silk reportedly sold for close to its weight in gold, and Roman aristocrats paid dearly for it season after season, year after year, sending Roman coinage flowing eastward along a route no Roman had ever walked to its source. That route did not have a name yet, not the name we use today. For nearly 2,000 years, the network of roads and caravan trails connecting China to the Mediterranean had no single title. It was not until 1877 that the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen coined the term Seidenstraße, the Silk Road, giving a poetic unity to a scattered and dangerous patchwork of trade that merchants themselves had never called by one name. The silk they carried passed through so many hands, Persian, Sogdian, Indian, Arab, that by the time it reached a Roman market, it had changed ownership perhaps a dozen times, and its price had climbed with every exchange. The middlemen understood exactly what they had. Persia, in particular, controlled the western end of the overland routes for centuries, and Persian merchants made certain that Rome, and later Byzantium, could never simply cut them out and trade directly with China. Every attempt to open a direct route was blocked, taxed, or made impossibly dangerous. Silk was not just a fabric moving from east to west. It was leverage. Wars were fought, alliances built and broken, entire diplomatic missions dispatched for the sole purpose of trying to bypass Persian control of the silk trade. The stakes climbed with every generation, because the thing being fought over was not simply cloth. It was who got to set the price of a fabric the whole known world had decided it could not live without. By the 6th century, that pressure had become a crisis for Byzantium specifically. The empire's economy and its religious identity were both tied to silk. Imperial purple, the deep violet-red dye reserved for the emperor alone, was most often applied to silk cloth, and church vestments, court robes, and diplomatic gifts all depended on a steady supply. But Byzantium and Persia were locked in recurring wars throughout Justinian's reign, wars that repeatedly closed the overland routes silk depended on. Prices spiked. Supply became unreliable. An empire that measured its own majesty partly in the color and shine of its fabric found itself at the mercy of its greatest rival for the raw material of its own prestige. It was in this climate of frustration that Justinian, according to the historian Procopius, began actively seeking a way to obtain silkworms directly, bypassing both Persia and China entirely. Procopius records that 2 monks came to the emperor with a proposal, having lived for years in a country he calls Sarinda, likely somewhere in Central Asia bordering China, where they had learned the secrets of sericulture. Justinian, desperate enough to gamble everything on it, sent them back east with the promise of great reward if they could bring silkworm eggs to Constantinople alive. The later chronicler, Theophanes of Byzantium, adds the detail that has survived into popular memory, that the eggs were smuggled inside hollow bamboo canes, packed with warmth and moisture enough to keep them from hatching too early or dying too soon. Historians today note that details across the different Byzantine sources vary, and some elements of the story may be embellished, but the broad event, silkworm eggs reaching Byzantium around 552 through the actions of monks connected to the emperor, is treated as historically credible. That is where the checkpoint from the beginning of this story sits. 2 monks, hollow canes, a guard's hand pressing against warm bamboo, an empire waiting to see if centuries of Chinese monopoly could be broken by 2 men willing to risk their lives for it. If the eggs died on the road, Byzantium would simply wait longer, pay more, remain dependent. If they lived, something genuinely unprecedented was about to happen. For one of the first times outside of Chinese and Central Asian control, an entire empire would be able to grow its own silk on its own soil, answerable to no caravan, no Persian tax, no foreign monopoly. But here is the detail that changes the shape of this whole story, the detail most retellings leave out. Justinian's monks were not the first to break China's silk monopoly. They were not even close to first. More than a century before the monks reached that checkpoint, the 7th century Buddhist monk and traveler Xuanzang recorded a story he had heard on his journeys through Central Asia, a story already old by his time. It concerned the kingdom of Khotan, a Silk Road oasis state, and a Chinese princess who had been arranged to marry its king. According to the account Xuanzang preserved, the king of Khotan asked his bride to bring silkworm eggs with her when she left China, since his kingdom had none and desperately wanted the industry for itself. Chinese law at the time forbade taking silkworms or their eggs beyond the border under any circumstance. So the princess, the story goes, hid silkworm eggs inside her elaborate headdress, where the border guards, out of respect or custom, did not search a royal bride. She carried the secret of silk out of China, not through espionage or imperial command, but folded into her own hair for love or for marriage, or perhaps simply for the security of a new kingdom she was about to call home. Historians are careful to flag this account exactly as it deserves to be flagged. It is legend, recorded by Xuanzang generations after the fact, undated with precision, impossible to verify with archaeological certainty in the same way we can verify Byzantine chronicles. But it is a genuinely old tradition, consistent enough across sources that many historians consider it to reflect something real about how sericulture actually spread west of China, likely sometime in the 4th or 5th century, well over 100 years before Justinian's monks ever left Constantinople. If that tradition holds even a grain of truth, it means the entire framing of Justinian's mission as the great theft that broke China's silk monopoly is incomplete. The secret had already leaked. It had already crossed a border, hidden not in a diplomat's hollow cane on a state mission, but in the hair of a young woman going to meet a husband she may never have chosen for herself. The empire's espionage was not the first crack in the wall. It was simply the moment the crack became large enough for an entire empire to walk through. This changes how we should read the checkpoint scene from the very beginning. Those monks were not stealing a secret no one else had ever touched. They were formalizing, on an imperial scale, a leak that had likely already been trickling west for a century through marriages, migrations, and the quiet movement of ordinary people who did not leave their names in any chronicle at all. The history of silk spread out of China is not one dramatic theft. It is a slow unraveling, thread by thread, until the empire that once guarded it with death sentences could no longer contain it. Whether or not the eggs in those hollow canes survived the entire journey to Constantinople is itself a point some historians debate, since the sources do not all agree on the exact timeline or the exact success of that specific mission. What is not in doubt is the outcome. Byzantine sericulture did take root in the 6th century, whether through this mission, earlier transmissions, or some combination of both. Silk production, which for 2,000 years had existed only within Chinese-controlled territory and a handful of Central Asian intermediaries, now had a foothold in the Mediterranean world itself. The first Byzantine silk was reportedly coarser than Chinese silk, the industry young and unrefined, workers learning through trial and failure how to keep silkworms alive, how to time the harvest of cocoons, how to reel thread without breaking it. But it grew. Imperial workshops in Constantinople began producing silk under direct state control, and for a time Byzantium held something close to a new monopoly of its own within Europe and the eastern Mediterranean, jealously guarded the same way China had once guarded its own. That monopoly, too, did not last forever. In 1147, during a Byzantine campaign in the Second Crusade era, the Norman king Roger II of Sicily sent forces that captured the cities of Thebes and Corinth, both established centers of Byzantine silk weaving. Historical accounts, including those of the Byzantine historian Niketas Choniates, describe Roger's forces carrying off skilled silk weavers from these cities back to Sicily, where they were set to work establishing a silk industry directly under Norman patronage. In a single military campaign, an entire craft tradition guarded for centuries by one empire was physically relocated to another. Sicily became Europe's next silk center, and from Sicily, the knowledge and the workers spread further into Italy, into cities like Lucca, Florence, and eventually Venice, each developing its own reputation for the fineness of its silk. From Italy, sericulture and silk weaving eventually reached France, where by the 16th century the city of Lyon had become one of the great silk weaving capitals of Europe, home to thousands of skilled weavers working looms by hand, thread by thread, pattern by pattern. It was in Lyon in 1804 that a weaver and inventor named Joseph Marie Jacquard introduced a loom that used a chain of punched cards to automatically control the pattern being woven, a mechanism that could reproduce complex silk designs without a weaver manually tracking every thread. The Jacquard loom is remembered today for more than silk. Its punch card system directly influenced Charles Babbage's design for the analytical engine decades later, one of the conceptual ancestors of the modern computer. A technology built to weave silk patterns became, indirectly, part of the intellectual lineage of computing itself. Silk's usefulness did not end with fashion or fine cloth. Its strength and lightness made it valuable in ways few other textiles of the era could match. In the 20th century, silk was used to make parachutes, prized for its combination of strength, low weight, and resistance to tearing under sudden strain. When the United States entered the Second World War, silk stockings, once an ordinary luxury, disappeared almost overnight because supplies were redirected toward military parachute production, and because Japan, previously the primary source of raw silk imported into the U.S., had become an enemy nation whose supply lines were cut. The shortage accelerated the adoption of nylon, first synthesized by DuPont chemists in 1935 and publicly introduced in 1938, which by the war's later years had largely replaced silk in military applications, marking one of the first times in over 2,000 years that a synthetic fiber displaced silk from a role it had held since antiquity. Why does any of this matter now to someone listening on a commute or before sleep, far from any silkworm farm or ancient checkpoint? Because the story of silk is, underneath the fabric, a story about how knowledge moves against the will of the people who try to contain it. China guarded the secret of sericulture with death sentences for roughly 2,000 years, and still it slipped out, carried in a princess's hairstyle, smuggled in hollow canes, captured alongside weavers dragged from their workshops in war. Every modern conversation about protecting valuable technology, about trade secrets, industrial espionage, or intellectual property crossing borders it was never meant to cross is, in its bones, the same story silk has been telling since before Rome existed. Secrets travel. They travel slower than we expect, and then all at once, they are simply everywhere. There is something else worth sitting with. The people who actually carried silk's secret across the world rarely appear as protagonists in the grand version of this story. It is usually told as emperors and empires, Justinian's ambition, Roger's conquest, Rome's gold flowing east. But underneath those names are the monks who risked execution for a mission that was not even their own idea. The unnamed weavers marched from Thebes to Sicily against their will, and, if the old tradition is to be believed, a young woman leaving home for a marriage she likely had little say in, carrying an empire's most guarded secret in her hair simply because someone asked her to. What we are left with, 3,000 years after a cocoon may or may not have fallen into an empress's tea, is a fiber that has been fought over, taxed, banned, smuggled, woven into computing's earliest ancestor, and stitched into the parachutes of soldiers falling out of the sky. It has been the reason senators worried about Roman masculinity, the reason wars were waged over trade routes, the reason a princess may have hidden something small and alive in her hair. Two things are worth carrying with you from all of this. First, that the greatest secrets in history are rarely broken by armies. They are broken by ordinary people crossing a border with something small and quiet, hidden close to the body. And second, that no monopoly, however fiercely guarded, however severely punished, has ever managed to hold a good idea forever. Silk was never conquered. It was only passed on, hand to hand, until no one could remember who owned it first. So the next time you touch something made of silk, a tie, a scarf, a lining stitched into a jacket, ask yourself whose hands it might have passed through to get there, and whether the secrets we guard so carefully today will prove any easier to keep than China's once was. What do you think finally moves a secret across a border, fear, ambition, or something as small and human as love? Main sources for this story include Procopius of Caesarea's History of the Wars, Pliny the Elder's Natural History, and Xuanzang's Great Tang records on the western regions, with additional detail drawn from the writings of the Byzantine historian Niketas Choniates. The full list is in the description.